Tonight I'd like to introduce to you, I'm going to make sure I say his name correctly because it doesn't sound like it's spelled, but it's easy. Attorney Jeremy Reidy. I said it right. He is a Fort Wayne native. He's a parishioner at Our Lady of Good Hope, a practicing lawyer in Fort Wayne at Beckman Lawson. He is married to Becky and has 4 kids, Ellen, Jillian, Henry, and Lucy, who are all here tonight to hear Dad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Attorney Jeremy Reidy.
How blessed we are to have Father David Mary and the Franciscan Brothers Minor here in our diocese. And also, how blessed we are to have Bishop Kevin Rhodes. He truly is one of the leaders of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And he and his brother bishops are doing the right thing at this crucial time in our history. The bishops are leading this FortNight for freedom because they know that if we don't fight vigorously for our religious freedom, we will lose it. We are losing it, and we've been losing it, slowly and over time, over the past century. I'm here today to address the attacks on religious freedom in this country. My way of background, as Father David Mary said, I'm Catholic by choice, a husband and father by God's grace, an American by birth, and a lawyer by trade. In my talk tonight, I'm going to start by defining the problems that have led us to where we are in our legal and political culture. Then I'm going to back up and give you some of the founding principles on which this nation was founded, and how we have drifted from those principles. Then I'll discuss some of the specific attacks we are currently facing in this country. Finally, I'm going to give you some of my thoughts about what we can do to change the tide of the culture and thereby protect religious liberty and bless the nation. To set the tone for where I'm headed, I will repeat what Pope Benedict XVI said to our bishops in their ad limina visit in 2012. He said, "I see the need for an engaged, articulate, and well-formed Catholic laity, endowed with a strong critical sense vis-a-vis the dominant culture, and with the courage to counter a reductive secularism which would delegitimize the Church's participation in public debate about the issues which are determining the future of American society." In other words, Pope Benedict XVI is telling us that what the nation needs now is an informed and courageous laity to engage in the culture. First, let's start with the problems we're facing. There's been a radical shift in the definition of freedom. Freedom has gone from the liberty to rule oneself according to reason to freedom as the absence of external restraints on action. We live in a country whose populace sees liberty as letting everybody do whatever he or she wants. This is what Pope Benedict XVI referred to as the dictatorship of relativism. The problem is, without objective truth, there cannot be true freedom. As our blessed Lord said, the truth shall make you free. The natural law allows every person to understand the difference between good and evil. The denial of good known through natural law is not good. On the contrary, it leads to enslavement. The Venerable Archbishop Fulton Sheen was fond of these examples. He said, "You are free to draw a triangle, provided you give the triangle 3 sides. If you give it 4 sides, you're no longer free to draw a triangle. Likewise, you're free to draw a giraffe, provided you give it a long neck. If you don't give it a long neck, you're no longer free to draw a giraffe." In other words, Archbishop Sheen is demonstrating that one is only free within the truth. Related to the definition of freedom, we've also seen a dramatic departure from the natural law. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI reaffirmed Blessed John Paul II's position that there is a natural law, and that this natural law can be known by all men and women through the exercise of reason. Natural law is inherent in the very nature of man because he is created in the image and likeness of God. That common nature binds them together and calls for universal respect and dignity. And as Blessed John Paul II said in his encyclical letter, Evangelium Vitae, every person sincerely open to truth and goodness can, by the light of reason and the hidden action of grace, come to recognize in the natural law, written in the heart, the sacred value of human life from its very beginning until its end, and can affirm the right of every human being to have this primary good respected to the highest degree. The natural law has been slowly but surely pushed out of our legal system by a growing propaganda effort to infer that those who insist that the right to life and the definition of marriage as being between one man and one woman are taking a, quote, religious position, which has no place in policy or political discourse. The culture is telling us that because such natural law positions are, quote, religious, they have no place in a public square and must be confined to church buildings. Related to this, another problem we are facing today is a distortion of the constitutional meaning of religious freedom. Today's governing class is attempting to take the founding principle of religious freedom, which includes the freedom of conscience, and transform it into the freedom to worship. There's a very real difference between those two concepts. Religion bears fruit in public witness and action. Our faith demands that we evangelize and provide charity to all people, whether they are Catholic or not, wherever they might be. This requires more than a mere freedom to worship. So what did the founders believe about religious freedom? And relatedly, what did they have to say about religion as part of the public debate? Our nation began as a haven for people who were different in their religious beliefs. Our founders saw religious faith as vital to the life of free people. Liberty and happiness grow out of virtue, and virtue is grounded in religious faith. They did not want an established church, but clearly understood that religion is a vital part of the social and moral order. We're all familiar with the Declaration of Independence, in which it says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This foundational statement clearly ties civil law to the natural law. A couple of examples of what our founders thought about religion in the public square. George Washington said this in his farewell address to the nation. He said, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason, and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle." The nation was also founded on principles of natural law. Thomas Hobbes and primarily John Locke, although neither of them got natural law completely correct, influenced the founders with regard to natural law. The role of government was not to teach or enforce right or wrong, but rather to protect men's natural rights to life, liberty, and property. John Locke had this to say, "The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it. Reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind, who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions." Another example, Alexander Hamilton said this, "Good and wise men in all ages have embraced a theory that the deity, from the relations we stand to himself and to each other, has constituted an eternal and immutable law, which is indispensably obligatory upon all mankind, prior to any human institution whatever. This is what is called the law of nature. Upon this law depend the natural rights of mankind." Archbishop Charles Chaput summed it up like this. He said, "Simply put, religious freedom is a fundamental natural right, and first among our civil liberties. And I believe this fact is borne out by the priority protection it specifically enjoys, along with the freedom of expression in the Constitution's First Amendment." Sorry, some microphone issues. So what has happened to religious freedom since the Constitution was written? The rationale of the constitutional interpretation that has led to the suppression of religious freedom was again summed up very well by Archbishop Chaput. He said the Supreme Court has gradually reduced the moral convictions that were so important to our founders to subjective religious beliefs. Many justices have implied that those subjective, purely religious beliefs cannot be rationally defended. Because they cannot be rationally defended, the religious beliefs should be treated as a form of bigotry. Just to give a couple of Supreme Court examples from our history to show how far we've come from where we started. In 1892, the Supreme Court actually declared the United States a Christian nation. Even as late as 1952, the Supreme Court had this to say about religious freedom. Our position radiates a spirit of freedom for religious organizations and independence from state interference, matters of church government as well as those of faith and doctrine. Obviously, much has changed in our country since 1952. The Supreme Court has had its share of problems with restricting religious liberty, but the majority of recent religious liberty suppression has come from the executive branch of government. This is intentional. In 2009, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave a speech at Georgetown University. Georgetown is, quote, Catholic. There she expressly laid out the executive branch's plan for religious liberty throughout the world. She said the United States government would continue to defend the rights of Muslims to go to the mosque on Friday, defend the right of Jews to go to the synagogue on Saturday, and defend the right of Christians to go to church on Sunday, against brutal dictatorships or cultural movements trying to prevent this. However, she said, they would no longer defend true religious freedom, the ability to live by the moral teachings of our faith during the rest of the week. The reason she gave for this policy shift? To promote the right for people to love in the way they choose. At least Hillary's honest about her position. The two attacks against religious freedom in the news today are the HHS mandate and the redefinition of marriage. As you will hear shortly, although the Supreme Court issued the decision declaring the definition of true marriage unconstitutional, it was the executive branch that forced the issue. These are not the only two attacks on religious freedom. The federal government is attacking some of the fundamental tenets of our faith. Most of these attacks are coming from the executive branch. Just to give some examples. Because we will not place children in same-sex homes, they are restricting our rights to facilitate adoption programs. Because we believe in providing food and shelter to all, they are criminalizing our charity toward undocumented immigrants. Because we will not provide contraception and sterilization, they are restricting our ability to issue aid to poor countries and refugees. It was recently discovered that the IRS, the agency, by the way, tasked with enforcing Obamacare, has been targeting pro-life groups in their applications for tax-exempt status by, among other things, requiring promises that the groups would not publicly oppose Planned Parenthood. For one group, the IRS went so far as to ask for the contents of its prayer intentions. Recently, President Obama, speaking in Northern Ireland, described Catholic education as divisive during a speech to 2,000 young people. Because the most urgent attacks are with regard to the HHS mandate and the redefinition of marriage, I'll focus on those for a minute. In focusing on these issues of religious freedom, I'm going to refer to three recent federal court decisions. The first was just handed down last Wednesday. It was United States v. Windsor, and it was with regard to the constitutionality of Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act. Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act put into law a definition of marriage as a legal union between one man and one woman. And they did this to apply to, I think, 1,000 different federal statutes. one of which was the IRS estate tax, and that was the issue that ultimately came before the court. As most of you have likely heard, the decision was disappointing for proponents of true marriage. Our Catholic faith, and indeed natural law, requires that we promote the definition of true marriage. Pope Benedict XVI had this to say: "The family founded on marriage, as the expression of the close union and complementarity between a man and a woman, finds its place here as the first school of the social, cultural, moral, and spiritual formation and growth of children, who should always be able to see in their father and their mother the first witnesses of a life directed to the pursuit of truth and the love of God." In Windsor, the court held that Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act is unconstitutional as a deprivation of the equal liberty of persons that is protected by the Fifth Amendment. In so doing, Justice Kennedy, speaking for the majority of the court, reasoned that the law is unconstitutional because it is motivated by a, quote, bare desire to harm couples in same-sex marriages. It's the court's conclusion, without any evidence to support it, that only people with hateful hearts could have supported such a definition of marriage. The majority of the U.S. Supreme Court essentially says that any effort to support true marriage is beyond the pale of reasoned disagreement. As only Justice Scalia could describe it, the court is adjudging those who oppose it enemies of the human race. Now, the case is strange in several respects. First, the case should have never been before the Supreme Court. Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution requires that in order for the Supreme Court to have jurisdiction over a case, there must be an actual case or a controversy at issue. It's for very good reasons. The founders knew, and common sense tells you, that the only way justice could prevail is if the two sides of a case have something to fight about. In this case, the executive branch, the president and the attorney general specifically, decided that they were not going to defend the statute. The president unilaterally decided that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. So he didn't want to defend it. That left us with a petitioner, a New York resident in a same-sex marriage, and the United States, the other party, on the same side of the issue. The petitioner and the executive branch therefore contrived the case in order to get in front of the Supreme Court. The court, by taking the case and deciding on the merits, essentially issued an advisory opinion, something the Constitution strictly prohibits. Second, as Justice Samuel Alito said in his dissenting opinion, the Constitution doesn't guarantee a right to same-sex marriage. Indeed, no provision of the Constitution speaks to the issue. The majority opinion seems to base its decision on substantive due process. That's a technical legal term. It's really kind of nonsense, but the point is, it's well established that any substantive component of the due process clause protects only those fundamental rights and liberties that are objectively deeply rooted in this nation's history. Same-sex marriage is clearly not deeply rooted in this nation's history. So what the court really did here, contrary to legal precedent and through unelected judges, was to create a very new constitutional right. Third, as Father David Mary pointed out, the opinion is rather confusing. So what are the practical effects of the opinion? The court issued a disclaimer within the opinion. The disclaimer is, states are sovereign over marriage. The disclaimer is going to create some pretty serious practical problems. For example, say a same-sex couple is legally married in New York. The couple later relocates to Indiana. Is that same-sex couple no longer legally married in Indiana? Some of you were likely married in other states and later moved here. Was your marriage still valid when you moved to Indiana? Of course it was. So what's the outcome in this case? The question's left unanswered. Was left unanswered last week by the Supreme Court. the question remains, does Indiana have to recognize on equal terms all marriages of couples from other states? Fourth, I want to point out what the court did not do. A, it did not redefine marriage for the entire nation. And B, it did not formally discover a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. Citizens and their elected officials are still free to define marriage in the true sense, and we should continue to do so. Shortly after the opinion was issued, our governor, Mike Pence, immediately called on Indiana to pass a constitutional amendment defining marriage as a union between one man and one woman. So how we went from a Christian nation to one that will not listen to anything that can be categorized as, quote, religious, is summed up well by Justice Scalia. He said, "The court's errors spring forth from the same diseased root, an exalted conception of the role of this institution, the Supreme Court, in America." The very next day, moving on to some better news, thanks to Hobby Lobby, we won a small victory with regard to the HHS mandate. We have to keep in mind that while the Supreme Court refused to say that Obamacare violated the Commerce Clause, that's what happened last year when Justice Roberts joined the majority, it has not taken up the issues surrounding the HHS mandate and the Free Exercise Clause. Eventually it will, and I hope and pray that the HHS mandate will be struck down as unconstitutional. Just last week, the day after this Supreme Court case was handed down, we got a favorable ruling along those lines. The U.S. Supreme Court for the 10th Circuit held that the HHS mandate was likely to violate the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Free Exercise Clause. I'm going to need that. I'm not Obama. I don't have a teleprompter. For a little bit of background, I'm not sure how much all of you know about the HHS mandate and its effect, but what it did in this case and what it would do to other organizations is it will leave companies and nonprofit organizations with really three choices. They either compromise their religious beliefs and provide these services, or two, they can refuse to provide the offending services and pay $100 per day per employee in penalties and taxes. Or three, they can drop insurance altogether and pay substantial fines and penalties every year. So obviously not a good position to be in. The court held that this choice, the choice I just described, presented a substantial burden on Hobby Lobby for following a sincerely held religious belief. There are more than 40 cases pending in the U.S. challenging the HHS mandate. Our diocese is one of those organizations challenging the mandate. We've had similar victories granting injunctions in the majority of the cases. That's good news. This provides us with hope that the mandate will eventually be invalidated by the Supreme Court. However, we have to keep this in mind. When I recently congratulated University of Notre Dame professor Charles Rice, who works on behalf of the Beckett Fund, on their victory, he astutely replied, "It's good news, but it's only round 2 of a 15-round fight." Another recent Supreme Court case provides a little bit of good news, and that's a 2012 case where the court unanimously held that the state could not interfere with decisions made by a religious group with regard to its selection of ministers. In that case, the court used some positive language. For example, it said, The Free Exercise Clause protects a religious group's right to shape its own faith and mission through its appointments. However, it also delves into the inner workings of the religious communities by attempting to define the role of minister. So we've got some good and some bad there. That case is similar to one we are battling currently in our diocese. It involved this issue. Does a religious institution have the right to not rehire an employee because that employee is not living in accordance with the tenets of the faith? At least in this instance, the court would seem to say that it does. Justice Samuel Alito provided some additional hope in his concurring opinion, stating, religious teachings cover the gamut from moral conduct to metaphysical truth. And both the content and credibility of a religion's message depend vitally on the character and conduct of its teachers. So what can we take away from these three cases? First, as Justice Scalia so aptly pointed out, the Supreme Court has taken on a role of activism that the founders never envisioned. The institution has transformed itself into a kind of moral authority for the nation, and its morals are largely in direct conflict with the Catholic Church. Second, there is hope. We have 4 Supreme Court justices who consistently support pro-life, pro-marriage, and religious freedom. All we need is one more, and the right cases to make their way to the Supreme Court to legally change the direction of this country. So, with all of that as background, what can we do about it? I'm going to give you a list of 7 things that I think we can do to influence the culture and hopefully change the suppression of religious freedom. The first is prayer. We can do the most to protect religious freedom by first opening our hearts to God's will. St. Thomas More is a model for how Catholics should bring their faith to the public square. He gave his life for what he believed. How is he able to be so strong? He developed a strong prayer life. He loved God with all of his heart. Strong formation through prayer will guide us to do what we need to do to defend our faith. And we must not confine our prayers to those that share our beliefs. We must pray for the conversion of the hearts and minds of those who would suppress religious liberty. Second, vote. Obviously, elections matter. We have several Supreme Court justices who support and uphold natural law and religious freedom. Pro-life and pro-marriage presidents appointed them all. In order to have the best chance to overturn some of the laws supporting the culture of death and barriers to religious freedom, we must elect public officials who support pro-life and pro-marriage initiatives. And contrary to what the culture would have you believe, we must take our faith with us to the voting booth. As Pope Benedict XVI said, it is inconceivable that believers should have to suppress a part of themselves, their faith, in order to be active citizens. Third, be Christ where you are in the world. In my opinion, this is the most important thing we can do. In one of our Blessed Lord's appearances to St. Francis, and Father David Mary, I'm not kissing up or anything here. Our Blessed Lord asked St. Francis to rebuild his church. St. Francis, with all sincerity and humility, wondered whether he could undertake such a monumental task. St. Francis understandably wondered why our all-powerful Lord wouldn't fix the problems with the church himself. Our Blessed Lord told St. Francis, "Until I come again in glory, I have no arms and legs. You are my body until I come again." This is a call to all of us. We are called to be Christ in the world. We have to change the culture from within. No matter what you do on a daily basis, do it in prayer. Reach out to your friends and coworkers. When they spend time with you, they should be able to say at the end of the day, "Today I was with a Christian." Fourth, and I have to give credit to Father James Bromwich on this. Use the natural law to persuade. In order to change the culture and change opinions with regard to these vital topics, we do not have to push our religion on others. Pope Benedict XVI said, "Strictly speaking, these human rights are not truths of faith, even though they are discoverable and indeed come to full light in the message of Christ, who reveals man to man himself. They receive confirmation from faith. However," he said, "the Church's action in promoting human rights is supported by rational reflection in such a way that these rights can be presented to all people of goodwill, independently of any religious affiliation they may have." George Weigel, in his new book, Evangelical Catholicism, has this to say: "We should not enter public life proclaiming 'the Church teaches' as the first move in the efforts to defend the integrity of marriage. Rather," Weigel continues, "make the argument in a language that those you are seeking to persuade can understand." Fifth, educate our youth. Archbishop Chaput says, "Forming intelligent, committed young adults is one of the most vital missions of the Church. The youth today face a culture that has abandoned religion. Researchers have discovered that vast numbers of American young adults are morally illiterate. They're not bad or evil, they simply don't have any real moral formation. As Archbishop Chaput put it, they believe in God, but in a generic, feel-good deism sense, with God's main job reduced to giving them what they want when they want it." Sixth, stay involved. We need to hold our institutions accountable. This is particularly important in the field of education. I went to law school at a quote Catholic university. I say Catholic in quotes because it had almost completely abandoned its Catholic identity. I learned constitutional law from a professor who was passionately pro-abortion. Catholic universities should not be espousing these positions. If your kids are in Catholic schools, ask what they're learning. If something concerns you, raise the concern with a principal or your pastor. If your kids are in public schools, supplement what they're being taught with good catechesis at home or at your parish. Seventh, support and pray for our bishops and priests. Our clergy mothers and sisters too. Sorry. Didn't mean to leave you out there, Mother. Our clergy are being persecuted. Francis Cardinal George was recently shouted down, cursed at, and protested against for refusing communion to a gay activist who was wearing a rainbow sash while approaching our Blessed Lord. Priests throughout the country have been subjected to harassment from secularists and atheists. This is only going to get worse. Nonetheless, the bishops must resist compliance with these unjust laws and regulations. As Blessed John Paul II said in Evangelium Vitae, Christians, like all people of goodwill, are called upon under grave obligation of conscience not to cooperate formally in practice which, even if permitted by civil legislation, are contrary to God's law. The same is true if the practices are required by civil law. Indeed, the Catechism states that there is a moral obligation not to obey unjust laws if, for example, those laws order citizens to do something they cannot do without committing a moral offense. If things do not change in this country, our clergy are going to be pressured to do many things that are contrary to our faith, and they will be penalized for refusing to comply. They need our support and prayer to remain strong in these times. That's a long talk. I'm going to conclude. with these. The best way to protect religious freedom is to remind people that they need to love God. I ask that you all pray for the strength to know that the freedom to publicly love God is worth fighting for. Father David Mary said it well in his introduction. But preserving religious freedom is secondary to changing the culture. Society will not care about religious freedom if it does not care about God. Our last two popes were genius in their call for a new evangelization. The new evangelization is exactly what the world needs in order to change the culture and for God to bless this nation. Thank you.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate having a lawyer with faith. You know what they say, there's all kinds of jokes about lawyers until you need one. But certainly what a beautiful explanation of what's going on in our country, how we've come to this place where we are and how to respond back to it. I'm so grateful to Jeremy Reidy for your wonderful presentation and the education we received from you this evening.